I'm going to make a few comments before we go into the talk, but normally, if you remember when we go to meetings in the old days, people would tell you all about where the toilets were and where the fire exits are. I'm assuming you all know that. When the time comes, we've done already. We will mute your microphones apart from Martin. I recommend people turn videos off when it comes to that, because they can be distracting sometimes when they pop up, and it doesn't give you the ability to go and do what you like. You don't have to be tied to the front.
I think you've muted, Bob.
Questions when we come to it, please put them in the chat. So at the bottom, when you bring up the chat, at the bottom it says a message to everybody. Put your questions in there. I'll try, or Alan will try at the end, to go through some of the questions in there for Martin, or Martin can maybe read them himself. But rather than messaging individual people, we'll do them by putting messages in chat, please. The recording, when we do it, will find its way online. If I don't manage to send you a link to where it is, you will find it by going through the CCS website. And I do plan to finish by 8, because I will be wanting my dinner by then. Okay, I did a quiz before Christmas. It's the third one I've done now. I say thank you very much to the 3 people who contributed questions for it. If you think there are any very hard questions in there, I can try to blame other people, but it was my own fault. I put a few sneaky ones in there that really aren't to do with the history of computing, but I really couldn't resist it. And it was Christmas anyway, so whatever. I'm hoping it sparked people's interest in some subjects as well. I'm hoping people actually managed to answer 1 or 2 questions and looked at things and thought, hey, that's great, I know what that is. But particularly the photographs of old computers that were in there. I've been doing a little bit of work, but mainly this is Jim Miles at the University in Manchester. He's going through a huge cache of old photographs that have been left around. They're stuck in a room. Like we tend to stick things in the attic. Well, the attic in the computer science department at Manchester University is full of old bits of odd, interesting kit, but also thousands of photographs. And Jim is going through scanning those, putting them online in a forum, and trying to work out what they all are. If you saw some of those photographs and thought, oh, I could work out what that is, Jim is looking for people to help identify what some of these photographs are. I mean, particularly, of course, if you have strong links with Manchester University, but not all the photographs by any means are of Manchester University. So anybody can help if they want to do a bit of detective work. If you look in the quiz underneath the photographs, you'll see information about Jim Miles and how to get in contact with him to join into that particular group. I must say, Jim and I spent ages. There's a picture in there of 3 ladies in an office in the 1930s with some old punch card equipment, and that was fascinating. And just going off trying to find out what that was, I learned rather a lot, which I think we all still quite enjoy learning quite a lot. For those of you who are new to this Computer Conservation Society, I only sort of became aware of it after I left work, and I discovered that the National Museum of Computing had a 2966, and then it also boomed from there. Just to read you what Roger Johnson, who normally runs his meeting, what he said a few years ago. He said, membership of the CCS has always been open to anyone who is interested in the history of computing, whether or not they're a member of the BCS. So those CCS is affiliated to the BCS, you don't need to belong to the BCS to be part of this. He said there's no qualification required other than an expression of interest. So if you want to join, join. If you want to come along to these talks, come along to the talks. Furthermore, there's no membership fee, although members receive an annual invitation to make a voluntary contribution. It's voluntary, and to be honest, this year we've not bothered because there's not been a lot to spend money on. It's usually helped to spend money on projects, etc. So if you want to find out about joining the CCS and get invitations to these sort of talks regularly, I'm sure you can work out how to do this through Google. Go to Google Computer Conservation Society, and you'll find out about joining under there. Right, today's talk about ICL, the history of ICL revisited twice, I said, because Martin has actually done this talk down in London to a room full of people. It was fully booked at the time, even in a small room in the middle of London, for people who could actually make it in there. So clearly it was very popular. Gordon went to the talk and he came back and he said it's really, really good. And since so many of us who turn up, not everybody, of course, a large number of us who turn up on a wet Tuesday or a sunny Tuesday in Manchester have links with ICL, quite a few worked at ICL, we wanted to see this again. So we invited Martin up to Manchester to give the talk, And he was quite pleased because it meant he could go and see some old friends, but well, stuff happened, didn't it? Anyway, for me, it's personal, and you'll see from all my ex-colleagues who are here as well. I started working in ICL in 1978, I think, beginning of April. It wasn't April the 1st, thankfully, but beginning of April, on a mainframe design team. I say it's a young man's dream job, really, designing computers, isn't it? If you're into that sort of thing, really, really cutting edge, exciting stuff back in those days. Things commercially with the company went down the hill a bit, but Rob Wilmot was brought in, got us links to Fujitsu, and in 1981, when my first child was 6 weeks old, I went out with a group of people to Fujitsu in Japan. We made 3 mainframes with Fujitsu technology, and I'm sure Martin will talk about those later. They must have thought we were pretty good as they went on and bought the company. I'd like to think that's because they thought I was personally very good, but I'm sure there's more to it than that. I stayed on with the company all the way through, became Fujitsu. I'd stopped designing mainframes. I went off and became what they called a computer solutions architect, which is a bit of a tedious job. When I looked back, when I retired, I found bits of old computer stuff that I designed back in my young days. And I realized quite how much fun that was compared to the stuff I was doing just before I retired. I discovered about the National Museum of Computing and about this society. And then I started to discover that the stuff I thought was exciting, cutting edge stuff back in 1978 is now museum pieces. So the 2966 is now in Bletchley, in the museum down there. I'm pleased to say that when I'm volunteering with a baby in the museum in Manchester, I've got an Estriel cube just sort of about 20 feet away to the left of me. So if anybody sort of says, what do you know about computers? I can say, me and my mates, we done that, which is really, 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 really fantastic. So history of ICL, I only ever saw it from a little narrow view from inside. There was a lot going on. The company's a lot bigger than anything I realized. But I was only just doing my little job, designing my little bit of computer. Lots of stuff going on outside. Martin's going to tell us, I hope, a bit more about what was going on when I was busy designing computers. So Martin is a emeritus professor in the Department of Computer Science in Warwick. He specializes in the history of computing. So this stuff is right up his street. He's a committee member of the CCS, not surprisingly. He's written multiple papers about Babbage. He is on, and I've written down in numerous advisory and editorial boards. His name crops up all over the place. I did know some Gresham College, which many of you know about. There's a couple of interesting videos by Martin on Gresham College. He's written one paper that I've just downloaded, and I'm going to read it over the next few days, called ICL and the Evolution of the British Mainframe, which I'm ashamed to say I've not actually read before, but that'll tell me more about what was happening before I started. He's written numerous books as well. The one that I think my kids would really, really love is the one that Airline Reservations to Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic's absolutely brilliant, but my 30-year-old kids are really, really keen on Sonic, and they're passing the fun onto their kids now. But also ICL, a business and technical history, which I think is possibly the basis of Martin's research that he's going to tell us about. So I'll say again, I think everybody is muted apart from Alan, Martin and myself. So if I hand over to Martin to bring up his slides and to take us through. Thank you, Martin.
Okay. Let me just share my screen and check it works. Does that work all right?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Martin. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, my title, ICL Revisited. What I meant by that was I wrote the book, it appeared in 1990, so about 30 years ago. And I'd never actually read it. I mean, I read the proofs, of course, but I never read the book, and I never read it subsequently. So in the summer of 2019, when I was asked to give this talk for the Computer Conservation Society, I read it for the first time in 30 years. And I also reviewed the notes I made on 30 interviews of people. And with the passage of time, I could be slightly more candid than I was 30 years ago when I first gave a talk on ICL to the Computer Conservation Society. For this talk, there's an awful lot to say, so I really had to restrict myself to kind of a very broad picture, and I've picked half a dozen themes that I think would be interesting. The first is how the book came to be written, and how I did it. The relationship between ICL and IBM, the secret war with the code-breaking machinery, and then the transition to computers, and of course the one of the great episodes in ICL's history is the new range. And lastly, of course, ICL didn't survive, and I really want to question whether it ever could have. So let me start then by talking about.
Can I just interrupt you? The
Yeah.
camera that you're using isn't pointing at you. We just see the top of your head.
Oh, right. Okay. Let me just. Oh, is that any better? It's because I'm reading a text. It's probably that's that any better?
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Good. Thanks for telling me that. Now, why isn't that working? Let's try again. Yeah. So how the book came to be written? Well, it's really due to David Marwood, who was the company secretary, and he's the person in the light suit, third from the left in that image. And he was very interested in computer history, and in fact was in the process of writing a paper about one of ICL's crises in the 1980s, which is on the right. And he wanted to start a computer museum or a national archive for computer history. And he convened a meeting on the 13th of September 1984 at ICL House in Putney. And I was along with quite a few other people who were invited to attend. We got talking, and subsequently he invited me down to come and have a look at ICL's corporate archive. And then, of course, what I found in there was the veritable Aladdin's cave. And of a special interest to an historian was that one of his duties as the company secretary was to write the minutes of board meetings. But what he had, in fact, were sets of private notes of things that didn't go into the board meetings, but the verbatim conversations of what was going on. Anyway, I made the suggestion, would you like me to write a company history? And he agreed. He probably didn't realize how naive I was. Other people I should mention who were enormous help with the book. Well, there's Gordon Bates, who was the company secretary from the mid-80s when David Marwood retired. I couldn't find a picture of him, I'm afraid. Arthur Humphreys on the left, who was one-time managing director of ICL. But he was also a director of the Charles Babbage Institute in the United States. So he was very keen on computer history. And we also had a slight connection in that I was at school at Manchester University studying computer science with his son, John Humphreys. So we knew each other very, very slightly. Jack Howlett is in the middle there, and I'll come to him in a second. And the person on the right is Bernard Bellringer. And he had founded the Technical Archive at Letchworth, which consisted of all IBM's technical materials, going right back to the turn of the 20th century. And Gordon Collinson took over from him when he retired. So in fact, there were two really good archives to write the story of ICL. The main problem was that I knew absolutely nothing about computer history, business history, I should say. I'd just completed a PhD looking at the development of computer programming, but I didn't know much about business history. So when I delved into it, I found it was actually a rather mature field, certainly compared with the history of computing, which really only got going about 1980. But there were two journals, Business History Review and another Business History, both of which had been going since the 1950s and 60s. And there was a very important book on business history written by Alfred Chandler. And the book, most unusually for a textbook, had written a Pulitzer Prize, had won a Pulitzer Prize. Chandler was very interested in the fact that I was writing the history of ICL because he wanted to write a book about the rise of the electronics industry. And in fact, that actually appeared many years later. It's called The Electronic Century. One of the problems I was warned about when writing a business history was the fact that you could spend a long time, years writing it, and that the lawyers within the company might eventually suppress it. And a number of people warned me about this. There's a recent story of somebody who'd written a history of an American insurance company. I think it was Metropolitan Life, but I could be wrong. They spent about 5 years on it, and then it had been squashed at the last minute. So I cooked up a ploy with Jack Howlett that what I would do would, while I was writing the book, I'd write a series of articles for the ICL Technical Journal. So that anything that was likely to be controversial had been published before the book came out. So then if eyebrows were raised about things I'd written, I could say, well, actually, this is already in the public domain. Let me say a little bit about the origins of ICL. I'm sure this will be very familiar to people who worked in ICL, less so to others. But ICL had two main ancestor companies, the British Tabulating Machine Company and a company called Powers Samus. Now, the BTM, the British Tabulating Machine Company, and IBM had a common ancestor, which was called the Tabulating Machine Company in New York. And Powers Samus came out of a similar punch card manufacturer called Powers Accounting Machine Company. And that eventually became Univac. So there's a rather close relationship between those early punch card machine industry and some of the major players in the computer industry. Now, the question is, what do you include in a corporate history? I think of a business history really as being the biography of a company. Unlike any biography, which relatives do you include? Which ancestors do you include? Well, I thought that the spine of the story, the principal character, was British Tabulating Machine Company that eventually becomes ICL. And its closest cousin was the Powers Samus Company. So those are the two main spines of the story. And then I would bring in the other companies like EMI, General Electric, Ferranti, as they came into the story. Those diagrams, by the way, were drawn by Bernard Bellringer. To understand ICL, you really need to understand its fraught relationship with IBM. IBM was, the ancestor company of IBM was formed by Herman Hollerith, who had been responsible for the, census machine in the United States. I'm just turned over 2 pages at once. And when the census was completed in 1890, Hollerith formed a company, the Tabulating Machine Company, TMC, to sell his machines commercially. The director of that census was a man called Robert Porter, who's on the left of the square images there. And Robert Porter was actually a Brit. And when the census was completed in 1890, he returned to Britain. And while he was sort of looking for offices, he encountered a man called Raleigh Philpotts, who was the company secretary of British Westinghouse. And it was Porter's suggestion to Philpotts that, why don't you license the Hollerith machines in the United Kingdom, which they eventually decided to do. And the other main character in those early years was C.A. Everard Green. And the company started in 1904 as the Tabulator Limited. And these are the first machines that they installed. So it's called the pin box tabulator, the machine on the left. It's a very crude device, but if you're familiar with the census machine, you'll recognize that. So this is actually the Lancashire and North Yorks Railway. And you can see the 4 census machines at the back, 4 pin box tabulators at the back, and a series of card punches on the front. It's not very clear what the original arrangement with IBM was. The original agreement was lost, was no longer in the ICL archive. But in 1907, the tabulating machine company introduced a new series of machines which were called the automatics. And this is really the foundation of IBM. So on the bottom left there, you've got a tabulator. You have what was called the vertical sorter next to it. Above that, the hand punch. You'll be very familiar with this equipment if you're familiar with ICL's punch card origins. The picture on the right actually is from an IBM collection. It's a rather beautiful hand-colored glass slide. Well, there was a problem with the relationship with the tabulating machine company, which by this time has become called BTM, the British Tabulating Machine Company, in that they needed to do a new agreement, and the arrangement was that BTM would be able to license the new automatic machines, but would have to pay 25% of its rentals to IBM as a royalty. This is an extremely onerous rate, but by comparison, the Powers Accounting Machine Company only had to pay 5% of their rentals to the American company. So it was a pretty tough deal. They conducted an audit after the First World War and found that BTM was deficient when they sent the orders in and had not paid 20,000 of royalties that were due. And of course, IBM then threatened, as it was then IBM, threatened to cancel the agreement. To smooth things over, Everard Green went to the United States. And the message he got from Tom Watson, who's on the right there, who was the managing director of IBM, was really to say what a dismal performance BTM was doing. If you just look at the comparative success with IBM, so this is an advert from about 1925 on the left, and you can see they've got 5 very large factories and a massive turnover. The argument that Tom Watson made was that they shared the market. BTM had the UK and the British Empire, and IBM had the rest of the world. So in terms of land mass, it was a ratio of about 2 to 1. IBM 2/3 of the world and BTM 1/3. But when you looked at their sales, the sales of IBM were 32 times greater than those of BTM. And really Watson wanted to shake away the British company and take it over. He tried to effectively bribe, this is something I wasn't able to say in the book, but effectively to try and bribe Everard Green into obtaining shares in a clandestine way so that he could take over the company. Well, when he got back to the UK, said there were very old English gentlemen in these in the British tabulating machine, and they were outraged that such an underhand thing could be even contemplated. Anyway, there was a new agreement, and it was very much the same as the previous agreement, a 25% royalty, with the exception that any machines that were designed and built in Britain and were not using IBM patents, they would be royalty free. So that encouraged BTM to have quite a big expansion. And it opened a factory, I think in 1922, which is it's a later photograph on the left when it had probably doubled in size. And the bottom right there is a machine that they're building, which is the tabulating machine. The person on the left, by the way, is Doc Keane, Harold Keane, who was the Chief Technical Officer for BTM. I'll mention him again later. Everything then goes quiet, really until Pearl Harbor in December 1941, when war starts. And then there's a complete about face from IBM, and it becomes BTM's best friend. It starts to send food parcels for BTM employees, and it pays for a Christmas lunch for the employees. And I'll come back to the IBM in a minute. That, by the way, is the first machine that BTM designed. So it's called the BTM Rolling Total Tabulator. And the point about it really is that it doesn't use any IBM patents and was therefore royalty free. Well, let me say a few words about BTM and the Secret War. When I was writing the book, very little had been written about the code-breaking activities at Bletchley Park. There was a book called The Ultra Secret that came out in 1974 by Frederick Winterbottom. Gordon Welchman had written a book called The Hut 6 Story in 1982. And Andrew Hodges, of course, wrote the Turing biography in 1983. But I didn't know very much more than was in those books. And what I found in the ICL minutes was very little indeed. There were frequent references to what was called the Cantab machine. And it turned out that that was referring to Cambridge University, Cantab. And that the ICL was building machines, code-breaking machines, which we now know as the bomb, for the code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park. And the person in charge of that was Harold Keane, shown on the right-hand side of that picture there. But I couldn't get any more details than that. So Gordon Bates, the company secretary, contacted some people in the ICL Pensioners Club to see if anybody was willing to come forward to talk to me. And the person who did come forward was a man called Norman Hedges. And we, according to the notes I made at the time, we met on the 10th of September 1985 in the canteen at ICL House in Putney. Hedges was one of 8 maintenance engineers, and he explained as best he could what the bomb looked like and how it worked. So I got him to sketch in my notebook, and these are Norman's original sketches of what the machine looked like. I found all that quite hard to understand at the time. You might notice on the left-hand thing, there's a reference to Uncle Walter, and that turns out to be an unpronounceable German name like Unkerwouts. And it was to do, I think it was called the turnaround reel. It was the turnaround wheel. It was part of the decoding machinery. Well, I'd never seen a picture of a bomb at that time. And so far as I know, none had been published. I could be wrong about that, but there was no internet then, and I'd never seen a picture in a book or anywhere else. So I wanted to include a picture of the bomb in my book. And I asked Norman if he could sort of sketch in a rather more detail than in my book that we could then send to the artists at Oxford University Press. And this is the image that they came back with. And I showed it to Norman, and he said, "Ah, it's wonderful." And then he suddenly said, "There's no wheels." And it turned out that the machine had wheels, and he'd forgotten to mention them. So we sent the image back to Oxford University Press, and you can see they put 2 wheels on the bottom there. Now, eventually I did get to see a picture of the bomb, and that's a photograph of a real bomb there on the right. I think it's a testament to Norman Hedges' memory. It's a strikingly good image. Well, what I found in the minutes, it was all very covert what was going on. So I was very grateful for the books that had already been published. Anyway, let me then move on to the next bit of my talk, which is about the transition to computers, because at this time, BTM and IBM for that matter, are punch card machine companies. By now, the old guard is changing. On the left there, that's the figure at the back is Raleigh Philpotts. He's now Sir Raleigh Philpotts because he's been knighted because of the work with the Cantab machines. But he retires soon afterwards and gives way so to the new managing director in the centre there on the right is HV Stammers, Vic Stammers. And then there's Cecil Mead, who's the sales manager, and on the right, John Davis, who's the engineering manager. Well, it's 1947 and the war's over and IBM decides to audit the royalty account again, remembering they're supposed to be paying 25% of their earnings to IBM. And what they found, the auditors find, is that there's a deficit of $350,000 that has not been paid to IBM. And IBM is now going to use this as a negotiating position. And in order to let BTM off the hook, it offers to terminate the agreement. And this would, of course, save BTM about $300,000 a year. And the company absolutely leapt at this offer. What would now happen is that IBM would be free to compete around the world. BTM could use all existing patents without royalty or charge. And then they'd be able to compete worldwide, including in the UK. What I wrote in the book was this was the greatest mistake the company ever made. But the agreement was signed on the 14th of October, 1949. Well, why was it such a mistake? Well, you can think of a set of reasons. One, of course, is that electronics and computers were on the horizon. And they understood that at IBM and BTM. Is that mine making that noise? Oh, well.
I don't know if it's somebody coming or going, but I keep
getting
it
as
well.
Right.
I just plow on through it anyway.
Oh, fine. Yeah, I bored them to death. Right. But the real reason is that IBM was actually under intense antitrust pressure that resulted in a settlement in 1956. So there's no doubt in my mind that BTM could have got far, far better terms from IBM than they did. They really could have charged them to be let off the hook. But anyway, on the 25th of October, 1949, IBM World Trade is formed, and it starts within a year or two actually trading in the UK and in Europe. Well, rather famously, Watson said the world would only need 6 computers, and I think we've all heard that. And in a sense, in 1948, he was not really wrong. The IBM view was that the important thing was electronics, and that would make their existing punch card machines much, much faster. They had no interest at that time in building stored program computers. So the first product they produced in the electronic era was the 603 multiplier, and it was just the same as the electromechanical multiplier, except they replaced the internals by electronics, and it ran 10 times faster. The advert on the left is a more advanced machine, the IBM 604, a calculating punch. And on the right, in order to satisfy what was an early market for computing, they designed the IBM card program calculator, the CPC. And it consisted of an IBM 604 calculating punch, a tabulator, and a storage unit. Amazingly, 800 of those machines were sold, and it really was the primary means of doing electronic computation until the advent of stored program computers in the mid-1950s. And actually, it outsold, you know, all the other world's computers combined. It was an enormously successful product. So what was BTM doing? Well, its response was basically to do what IBM was doing. So they produced an electronic multiplier, the IBM 552, and they produced a calculating punch like the IBM 604. You can see an image of it there. But obviously, computers were on the horizon. Now, unfortunately, the technical director, excuse me, Harold Keane was very reluctant to go into electronics. He had grown up in the tradition of extremely reliable accounting machines that needed to be perfectly accurate, and did not believe that electronics using valves was capable of that. So the way they defused the situation was to form a small computer development group, not under Keane's control, and appointed John Womersley, who had led the development of computing at the National Physical Laboratory. And when Womersley came around, he scouted around to see what computers might be available for BTM to use, and it turned out that the Deuce was already spoken for by Deuce. The Manchester machine was being developed by Ferranti, and the EDSAC at Cambridge was being developed by Leo. So the other machine that was a possibility was at Birkbeck College, University of London, and that's the machine on the right. It's called the APEC. There's a story interesting. The person who built that machine, Andrew Booth, had a reputation as being a bit of a character. The story was that he had on, if you can see the writing there, you will see it's written, it says APE brackets RC. So the idea there was it's the all-purpose electronic computer for the Rayon Research Association. And he had several people who were interested in the machine. One was for X-ray crystallography. So that machine was the same, but with an X in place of the R. And the story is that when visitors came, if, for example, they were from BTM, he would change the letter to an H for Hollerith, giving the impression that this was the machine he was developing for them. Anyway, the design was taken up by Raymond Bird and developed. And that is the machine on the top left there, an original photograph of the prototype HEC computer, as it was called, Hollerith electronic computer. And that was completed about 1954. Just underneath there in the colour image, that's Raymond Bird, actually. That original prototype now lives in the Computer Museum at Bletchley Park, and it was inaugurated by Raymond Bird 2 or 3 years ago. And on the right is the production version of the machine, which is a data processing machine, and it's called the HEC4. And eventually that becomes the BTM 1201. It's not much talked about it, but it was actually extraordinarily successful. Over 100 machines were built, and it outsold all of the other UK computers. So, for example, the Ferranti Mark I sold in the low 30s, and the English Electric Deuce was about the same. So this sold 3 times as many of either of those machines. Anyway, moving on, as they were transitioning to computers, it was clear that they needed a proper computer strategy. There are quite a few documents in the archive, and this is a diagram I constructed to sort of encapsulate all that material. And what they wanted to do was to address two issues in this computer strategy. The first was the arrival of transistors. Everything up to that time was using vacuum tubes. And the second was to develop a real-time computer for transaction processing rather than batch processing. So they thought that the 1200 machine, the BTM 1200, would keep them going up until the late 1950s. It was a vacuum tube machine, but selling well. They've made a partnership, a joint venture with the General Electric company for the 1301 computer, which was a transistorized machine. And then they had under development what was called the 1400 machine, which was a real-time computer. And if I show you a diagram there, that's 1301 artist's impression on the left. On the right is the 1400 series. It was called, the prototype was called Diana. And underneath is the real-time disk store that it would be used for real-time transaction processing. Eventually that was abandoned because it was a valve machine. And obviously by the time by the early 60s, it was quite clear that there was no future for valve machines. Well, the next big stage in ICL's history is the merger between BTM and Powers Samus to form International Computers and Tabulators, ICT. The reason for this merger was that BTM could have had a very good future on its own, but it had a burgeoning demand in this era of pent-up demand for punch card machines. They were selling all they could get and had a huge waiting list for machines. And they didn't want to open any more plants because they could see that the days of the tabulator were limited. And on the other hand, Powers Samus had an enormous manufacturing plant, but had been very unsuccessful in transitioning to electronics. So this was the rationale for the merger. BTM would gain manufacturing capacity, and Powers Samus, which might well have collapsed, was sort of was rescued from bankruptcy effectively. And that's the signing of the documents there. That's Terence Maxwell on the left, Colonel Maxwell, and Cecil Weir on the right, who was the BTM chairman by then. Well, there's a real game changer happens that's really going to upset the computer strategy in October 1959 with the announcement of the IBM 1401 computer. And it's a game changer for the whole industry, including for IBM. They had planned to sell 2,000 of this machine, but they ended up selling over 10,000. They completely got their market forecasts wrong. And the industry was switching very quickly from punch card machines to computers. The reason, though, is interesting. It was because the 1401 came equipped with a chain printer, as it was called, which printed at 600 lines per minute. That's the 1403 printer. Now, a standard tabulator printed at 150 lines per minute. So effectively, if you bought in this printer and a computer, you could get rid of 4 tabulating machines. Now, what then happened, of course, because these machines were rented, people could simply say, well, we don't want the tabulating machines anymore. We'd like a new computer, and that's exactly what happened. And it was a terrible time for IBM. By about 1962, they dropped sales by 30% in 6 months for tabulating machinery. In fact, there was a story that as these machines were being returned from customers, they were being stacked in an enormous warehouse about 6 deep. And gradually the ones on the bottom layer were getting squashed by the ones on top. So Arthur Humphreys, who is now head of marketing, has to sort of revise the future product plan. And he has negotiations with virtually every computer company on the planet. In the UK, he has negotiations with EMI, with Leo, with Ferranti, with English Electric. He goes over to the States and talks to Burroughs, and there's a plan to have a new company, Hobo, Hollerith Burroughs, but that plan falls through. He goes to Univac, and they make a small punch card machine called the 1004, which is manufactured under license. He goes to RCA, and they pick up the RCA 301, and that becomes the IBM, the BTM, correction, the ICT 1500 computer. He also talks to General Electric, Control Data Corporation. Well, one of the firms he talked to, of course, was Ferranti, and it turned out that they had a machine under development in Canada. Oh, sorry. They had a machine under development in Canada, which was called the FP 6000, Ferranti Packard 6000. And it's really Peter Hall's idea. That is Peter Hall on the right-hand side there, who's facing front. So second from the right. And his idea is that they could turn this FP6000 into an ICT product, and it would be a project set, which was the terminology at the time, that it could be the basis for a compatible range. This idea of a compatible range is often thought of as being an IBM invention, but actually I was told that it was widespread in the industry and everybody was thinking along the same lines. So this is what they decide to do. It's Arthur Humphrey's decision, and it's decided on Easter Monday, 1963. They decide to go with the FP6000, and that's going to become the ICL 1900. And the merger takes place in September 1963. What then happens is that Basil de Ferranti, who's the second son of Vincent Ferranti, becomes the managing director of ICT, and Arthur Humphreys continues in his role as director of marketing. It turns out not to be a great appointment, Basil de Ferranti. People I spoke to were pretty scathing about him, but for example, when I checked my notes, I recorded that Terence Maxwell, the chairman, described him as a rich, spoiled young man, and there were lots of other comments on the similar vein. But I should say, when the book came out, Arthur Humphreys said he was very pleased with it, but he did have one quibble with me. He thought I had been very unfair to Basil de Ferranti. I didn't feel very good about that, but it was I was reporting what I was told. Well, what's the next bombshell in ICT's history? Of course, it's the IBM System 360, which was announced on Tuesday, 7th of April, 1964. It just happened that an ICT team headed by Arthur Humphreys was actually at Cherry Hill with RCA in the United States in the very week that this was announced on the Tuesday. And they've been talking about a joint development for a future range of computers. So the ICT people said, well, what are you going to do now? To which they said, we'll decide by the weekend. So leave now, come back on Monday, and we'll let you know what we're going to do. So the ICT team kicked their heels for a few days, came back on the Monday, and RCA said, well, what we're going to do is to make an IBM compatible computer, which will be code compatible with System 360. And we will have the benefit because our electronics is much better than that of IBM. So we'll be able to compete with them on that basis. And that, of course, eventually becomes the Spectra 70 range. Well, when they get back to England, they're really facing a dilemma. Do they carry on with a project set based on the ICL 1900, or do they take up the RCA offer of the Spectra 70? And again, this is Arthur Humphreys' decision, and he calls it his $2 billion decision. And it was because The 1900 was a second generation machine, but it had the advantage of actually existing. And they could get deliveries going by early 1965. And it was announced in September 64, that's what they would go with. And it was an incredibly successful period for the company. They started to grow very rapidly. I think I can show you their financial statistics, but if you just cast your eyes down those statistics, the revenues have increased from, in 7 years, they've increased from 24 million a year to 66 million. So it's an enormous growth. Just a sec. Now, if you look at the second column there, you'll see that suddenly that they lose £100,000 in the year. And that's because of the collapse of the tabulator market. Now, what's going to save them actually is a government merger and the formation of ICL. And I want to talk about the politics and the economics of the new range, not so much about the technology. But there are two important backdrops to the new range development. And the first is political. If you look at the fluctuating governments, you had Labour governments about half the time, and they were extremely interventionist in industry and thought it was a government responsibility to support industry. On the other hand, the Conservative governments of the era were very hostile to any form of state intervention. So the second problem was an economic one, and this was the fluctuating dollar-pound exchange rate. And it actually fluctuates between $1.1 to the pound as much as $2.8 to the pound. So that's a huge variation over a relatively short period of time. And bearing in mind that for ICL, its exports constituted 60% of its income, it was an enormously difficult managerial problem. Well, Labour wins the election in October 1964, and you'll remember Wilson talking about the white heat of the scientific revolution. And one of their first acts is to form the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation and a Ministry of Technology. In his memoirs, Wilson wrote, as soon as he took office in October 1964, he was told that he had about 1 month to save the UK computer industry and that this must be his first priority. Well, Anthony Wedgwood Benn there, who's interacting with the Honeywell robot, becomes the first Minister of Technology. He's very highly involved in the negotiations. I should say initially there didn't seem to be very much to go on in terms of writing the history, but I had noticed a set of box files in the ICL archive with the name Tehran written on them, as in the capital of Iran. And anyway, I happened to open one. I discovered it was all the documents relating to the merger. And what it was a code name, so that it was always called the Tehran project, not the merger or anything, so that it didn't leak to the press. But there, in fact, there were just shoals and shoals of documents about this merger. Well, in April 1967, Wedgwood Benn agrees to offer the company £25 million as a grant if ICT and English Electric merge, and that this money could be used to design a new range of computers that would compete with those of IBM. Of course, the next question is it possible to make a joint range without losing all your existing customer base? So in July 1967, the 3rd to the 5th of July, 6 people, 3 from English Electric, 3 from ICT, and they included George Felton from BTM and John Pinkerton from English Electric, hold a feasibility study to decide if it's possible to make a new range of computers or in some other way resolve the issue of having 2 ranges, the English Electric System 4 range, which was IBM compatible, and the 1900 series. So the merger was agreed between English Electric and BTM. And then there are 3 more bombshells. The first is that Plessey decides it would actually like to take over ICL, and rather than English Electric merging with it. Then EMI decides it would like to do the same thing, and that happens in September 1967. And then in November 1967, sterling is devalued, and there's an enormous economic crisis engulfing the government. So how it's resolved is that Plessey gets 18% of the company. EMI's John Wall, on the left of that image, becomes the new chairman. Arthur Humphreys at last becomes managing director. But unfortunately, because of the devaluation of sterling, they now think they can only give, or will now only give them, the company 13.5 million instead of the 25 million originally promised. It is pretty catastrophic, but it's really past the point of no return. By the way, an interesting footnote, Arthur Humphreys was paid £12,000 a year as managing director. He's on the right in that picture. When you translate that into 2021 figures, it's actually, he was actually paid 213,000 a year. This was an FT100 company, and I discovered that the average FT100 salary is now 3.61 million. Anyway, now it's planning for the future, and it's the New Range Planning Organisation, which is headed by Mike Forrest. They have 7 options ahead of them, and eventually they decide on what's called the synthetic option. So option 1 is sticking with the English Electric System 4. Option 2 is sticking with the 1900 series, and various other suggestions. And the synthetic option is a completely new architecture, and that is what becomes the 2900 series. These are the minutes of the meetings that took place. Well, what's happening at ICL is that it's encountering another economic crisis. There's a massive downturn in 1970-71 that affects all the computer industry. So, for example, RCA and General Electric both quit the industry at this time. ICL has to lay off 1,600 people just to avoid a loss. And it asked the government for 35 million R&D subvention. Well, the problem that's facing ICL at this time is that its R&D is very good, but it can't afford to be doing it. So if you just look at this table, so this is 1969, you can see that most of the firms are spending of the order of 6% of their turnover on research and development. By contrast, ICL is getting on for 12%, nearly twice as much as the industry average. And that's why they need this money. Well, of course, the Heath government is very hostile to industry support. As soon as they get in office in 1970, they kill off the Ministry of Technology and disband the Industrial Research Corporation, and they have what's become known as the lame duck policy, that they will not intervene in industry. What changes it, of course, is that Rolls-Royce goes bankrupt in 1970 and has to be rescued by the government, and that becomes Rolls-Royce 1970. So ICL they decide they will also rescue ICL, and they recognize that the problem is the cost of research and development. So they agree to make the company a loan incidentally, not a grant, of £50 million, provided they change the management. So we have a new chairman. It's Tom Hudson, who was formerly UK Managing Director of IBM, and was then chairman of Plessey, and Jeff Cross, who was a Univac executive. And Arthur Humphreys becomes deputy chairman. Well, Jeff Cross was an absolute financial wizard. He became Young Businessman of the Year in 1976, by which time the company was in great shape, and he left in 1977 when Chris Wilson was appointed the new managing director. That's Chris Wilson on the right of the picture there. And of course, the ICL 2900 series was launched in October 1974. Well, as you see from these figures, ICL is actually doing pretty well. It's steadily growing at something I think around 30% a year, doing very well. Until 1980, when there's another recession in the computer industry, but Margaret Thatcher's now in power and far more doctrinaire than Ted Heath was about not rescuing lame ducks. Sterling is hitting its peaks, and they have decided on neoliberal policies. Thatcher and Joseph both thought that ICL was a basket case and would be quite happy to have seen it go the way of British Steel or British Coal. Chris Wilson told me that what he heard from Keith Joseph said, well, why don't you just sell the company for a penny to an American company? Well, what saved ICL was the fact that in 1982 was the information technology year when the government was going to be promoting information technology, and it was felt that if ICL was to go bankrupt the same year, it would not look good. So they decided to give the company a £200 million loan, again a loan, not a grant, but of course on condition that it changed its management. So this is the new management team. That's David Marwood in the light suit again. The new chairman, second from left, is Christopher Laidlaw, who's a very influential city person. He's a director of Barclays Bank, deputy chairman of British Petroleum. And the new managing director is going to be Rob Wilmot, who's on the right there, holding a glass. And he, at that time, was managing director of Texas Instruments in the UK, but with a very good reputation. I interviewed Christopher Laidlaw. He invited me to meet a lunch at the Garrick Club in January 1989. He was a very grand gentleman. And he told me about how they'd managed to get Rob Wilmot. And Laidlaw had invited him to discuss the option at his home in Chester Street in central London, where Rob Wilmot apparently paid hardball about getting the maximum salary and some stock options. I recorded in the notes, but not in the book, that Laidlaw described him as being a greedy little bugger. Well, Rob Wilmot actually had a reputation for arrogance that almost everybody who met him remarked upon. And for example, wouldn't hold one-to-one meetings with people, but preferred to have more of a lecturing style. And he was the only person I contacted who refused to be interviewed. By contrast, Peter Bonfield on the left, who was the deputy managing director, was a completely different. They both came from Texas Instruments, but Bonfield was approachable, very likable, and incidentally, he had family connections with the old BTM. His father had worked there. But anyway, to be fair to Rob Wilmot, he did have a masterstroke. He knew an awful lot about the semiconductor industry, and he got Fujitsu to supply chips for the 2900 series. So that enabled ICL to stop manufacturing its own semiconductors and was a huge saver for it. But he did reduce the headcount of ICL over a period of 5 years by about 40%, from 33,000 to 20,000. So it was a terrible time of bloodletting for ICL. But it was a very successful period. So by the mid-80s, ICL is actually doing very well. Laidlaw retired in 1984. And Michael Edwards, who had been responsible for the rescue of British Leyland, became new chairman in July 1984. But just 4 months after he takes office, there's a takeover bid from STC, which has decided that the future is going to be the convergence of computers and communications, a theme that comes up quite often in the history of ICL, but doesn't always pay off. But anyway, they make a very good offer, which the board feels obliged to accept on behalf of the shareholders. Edwards and Wilmot both resign, and Peter Bonfield takes over as chairman and managing director, a joint appointment. Well, by this time, we're talking February 1989, and he's now been in power for about 4 or 5 years. And I'm on the point of shipping my manuscript to Oxford University Press. It's all been checked over by the company secretary and some other people he consulted. And now it was for Bonfield to have the final say. Well, obviously, I wanted to complete the book by, as you do with a business history, by saying, you know, what did I think that ICL's future would be? And I had written that, well, I thought that ICL would probably survive because typically 100-year-old companies do survive another 100 years. But, you know, the evidence was that throughout its history, every 10 or 15 years, there's been a major trauma and a rescue by the government or other sources. And that was pretty much what we could expect for the future. Well, I had an interview with Bonfield. In fact, put it another way, he had an interview with me, and he called me into his office. And he said he was pretty distressed by this, by my description of ICL and its future. In fact, what I wrote down in the notes I made in the interview was that it was as I wrote as though ICL had a death wish. And of course, I was aware that ICL could refuse to publish the book because that was in the agreement I had with them if they were not happy with it. So Bonfield made me this very generous offer, and he said, well, look, if you will drop that last section describing ICL's potential future, I won't look at the rest of the book. So that was how our interview terminated. I think in retrospect, I did actually think that ICL would survive, but I think Bonfield probably knew, this is 1989, that Fujitsu was going to acquire the company. And in fact, Fujitsu acquired ICL in 1990, just months after the book was published, I should say. Well, just my last slide about whether ICL could have survived. I think in retrospect, it probably wouldn't have. If you just look at what happened to IBM and the bunch, the other companies, in 1986, Burroughs and Univac were finding times very difficult and merged as Unisys. In 1991, the National Cash Register, NCR, was acquired by AT&T and sort of disappeared from sight. Control Data Corporation, another one of the six, was broken up and sold off. And then Honeywell quit the business altogether again in 1991. And if you recall, IBM scored the record for the largest loss annual loss in corporate history. It lost $5 billion in a year. Of course, IBM has recovered, but it's hard to imagine that ICL would have escaped would have escaped the 1990s without a major catastrophe. Well, I will stop there and let Bob take over.
Right, let's put my video back on again.
Right, I'll close my slides.
Okay, thank you very much. There's an awful lot of stuff there. There's an awful lot of history, and as we know, there's the history of Fujitsu after that. There's a few questions come up. Lots of people really making comments to each other as much as anything else. One I threw in very early on is maybe start by answering my own question. When they merged and formed ICT, do you think, Martin, that they called it ICT because it sounded like IBM, or was it just total coincidence?
No, I think that's just coincidence. I'm not sure. It was possibly a bit apocryphal, but the idea was it was in international computers and tabulators. So computers was the future and tabulators was the present and would soon be the past.
Okay. Brian Russell. Brian, do you want to turn your sound on and ask your question? If you're around, or you can answer. Brian was asking when the ICL merger was actually announced.
Oh, date. I think it was 1987, and it was vested. I think in 1980. I'm just speaking from memory there. It was 1970.
He says he's asking because his wife was offered a job with ICT and then got offered a job, applied for a job at ICT, and got offered a job by ICL. So in about late 60s.
Yeah, it's actually more complicated than it sounds, because they agreed to merge. Then there was a government white paper for the merger, and then they actually, and I think it might have been September 1969. I don't know if that would be consistent with with job offers.
Yeah, okay.
September 68 it was.
Oh, thank you. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, can I intervene? It's Alan Wakefield, actually sticking my finger up down there.
Yeah,
right?
I can see you. Yeah.
And okay, where's Martin? Hello again, because we had this conversation back when you did your original presentation in London, but I just commented earlier that I think you jumped quite quickly over the bit of Tom Hudson and Jeff Cross. One of the things that they actually did, which was quite useful keeping ICL afloat, as we know, while the 2900 scene was struggling, was to acquire Singer Business Machines, and that sort of got us into a whole new area, small systems and retail, etc. So I think that needs a little more support and emphasis, really.
Yes, I quite agree. It was really shoehorning what I could into there. There's a lot about the Singer acquisition in the book.
Yes, yeah, you're true. But I understand you had to try and compress the presentation into. But just I was personally quite heavily involved in that, as you well know. But anyway, good.
It was an incredibly good acquisition. That was Jeff Cross, I think, wasn't it?
Was indeed,
they acquired a manufacturing plant in Utica in New York. It never developed more than that, actually, but it would have given them a toehold into the United States if things.
Yeah, I think that wasn't quite the main objective, really. It was really to support the retail business situation that we were trying to sort of get into, as you understand. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for your second presentation.
We got a couple of people commenting about ICL, or Adams ICT at the time, was doing wonderfully well when it was led by engineers, but it all fell to pot when they were being run by accountants. I don't know, Martin, whether you would disagree with that or not. I'm not sure we've got any accountants on the call, so you can let rip either way.
It's a tricky one, that, isn't it? And I started off, you know, I'm a computer scientist by background, so I didn't know very much about business. In fact, I didn't even know how to read a balance sheet before I wrote this book. But I ended up actually with a very deep respect for the people who managed it, because if you just look, for example, at the way the pound was fluctuating all the time, how difficult that was in managerial terms. So in a sense, the technicians and engineers are kind of on a somewhat more straightforward trajectory. They're influenced by ups and downs of the business, but sort of at the secondary move. One of the comments that Arthur Humphreys made to me once was, because people would ask him, you know, what was his gift? And he said, well, what a good manager has is making good decisions with very imperfect information. And that phrase, that characterization always stuck with me, because he was extraordinarily good at that. But if you just think of the decision to go with the 1900 series, in the face of the IBM System 360, the fact that it was a second generation machine, but he was weighing up the fact, yeah, but it's in the market, it's there and it works and it won't have any development problems. You can see what skillful decisions they were being made. Now, I don't think that that the engineers would have made those kind of decisions. I don't think it wasn't really in their mindset, that kind of thing. I must say, you know, I'm an academic, and universities are a little bit similar, really, in that the teaching staff in a university and engineers in a company, the company really exists as a cradle for them to do what they want to do, and generally they're not buffered so much by the financial concerns. But you know, within the university sector, they have extreme financial difficulties and fluctuating incomes and fluctuating student enrollments and so forth. They're really difficult problems for them to deal with, and the academics just go sailing forward. I don't think the industry is nearly as difficult as that, but certainly in places like actually hospitals and universities, you do find that there's people can just sort of roll with the waves much more than managers can do. Not sure that's any sort of an answer to the question.
I've been doing a bit of family history recently, and I know how difficult it is to sort of get all the family on a chart, and you find out about great uncles and whatever. Somebody was just said no real mention of Leo in your talk. Now, obviously, you had to be very choosy about who you put in there, but feelings about Leo and their.
Yeah, again, it is talked about in the book. The decision I made, as I said earlier, was to sort of talk about BTM and Powers as kind of being the spines of the firm, and then I'd sort of bring in the others as they joined in the company. So that Leo is mentioned in the book, but probably not in as much depth as the questioner would like. But it was really just a question of kind of proportionality, really.
I'm seeing loads of questions popping up now, which is going to be a bit difficult. One or two people asking about STC as well. Was STC owned by ITT? Do you know? I mean, I must say, my own personal view of STC is, you know, talk about buying a pup. I always felt we'd been bought by a pup at that point. I don't know how the rest of the company felt, but oh God, we've been bought by a telephone company. But were they owned by ITT?
There was a connection, and I can't remember what it was. I must say, actually, that the STC takeover actually occurred while I was writing the book. So it sort of wasn't part of the history I was going to write about it. It was the current event at the time I was writing the book. I think everybody was quite confused by it, and probably I think everybody but the shareholders weren't that enthusiastic about STC.
I do remember one thing that came out of it. We were all given cheap telephones to use at home. They weren't free, but we had to pay for them. Roger Cooper is saying, as an accountant, he said, I think we kept the company afloat at times. Yeah, Roger, But if you want to add any more, if you want to unmute yourself and add any more to that, but I think we probably agree with you. Roger, you want to say anything on behalf of accountants?
No, it's just that we're brilliant. We kept the company afloat.
We had some fantastic machines and no money. Yeah.
That was the real problem, and I was part of the STC negotiation, and the real problem there was that we really thought we were heading for bankruptcy, and it dug us out.
I think having been, like a lot of people on this call, deep in the guts of the company, particularly in the 1980s when so many people were made redundant, and you came into work with a sinking feeling every day. This is a comment from Dan Hayton. A firm run by engineers never makes money. A firm runs by accountants never makes anything. Possibly a bit.
It's a bit cruel, that is, but I sympathise with it. Yeah.
When I graduated from Manchester University, I was offered a job by ICL, but I decided in the event to go into teaching. But when I wrote the history, I could think of 3 distinct points in time when I would have got fired, when I been made redundant.
Yeah. So 1 per desk. Was it a 1 per desk? Somebody said. I mean, there were a lot of things that came in ICL in the later days that somehow, for those of us in mainframe, and I think a lot of people online today are from the mainframe division because that's the way I sent the message out. But did you think it was very much a mainframe dominated company, Martin, and the rest were appendages?
Yeah, I think the culture of ICL was very mainframe dominated. But when you looked at products like the 1 per desk, which never really went very far. But then on the other hand, when you look at the Singer acquisition, that was really good. So there were sort of a lot of not all the geese turned out to be swans, I think, that you've got a strong sense. Particularly in the Wilmot era, that they were really trying everything. There was the network product line, for example, in the 1980s.
Absolutely, right.
Trying to attach everything to everything and make the networked office. And it was very far removed, really, from mainframes. But I think they were just trying to survive and move with the market. I think it was pretty clear by the early 80s, although the PC hadn't quite taken off, it was pretty clear that the era of the mainframe, I think, was coming to an end, or at least there was other things coming in to complement it in terms of small computers.
Yeah, I'm struggling to look at all these comments that are popping up. Unless Brian Caswell waving a brochure or something at the camera. Would you like to unmute, Brian? Tell us what it is.
Is it the 1 per desk?
Yes, it is. I have one.
What, really?
Yes.
There's one in the Science and History Museum in Manchester as well that I can talk people if people look very interested when I'm volunteering, I say, and there's this, and they're absolutely confused by what the heck it is. John Haley.
I found it in the attic as we were clearing out, and I've still got it when we moved.
I found a load of interesting stuff in my attic. John Haley, I'm assuming that's John Haley I used to work with. He said, no talk of Professor Brian Warboys and his role in new range development. Well, I guess there were a lot of people involved in new range development. Does he get a mention in your book?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And he's one of the people I interviewed, actually. He was an external examiner for our Bachelor of Computer. He became a professor at Manchester University, and he was our external examiner at the time I was writing the history. So I interviewed him, and we had a number of sort of conversations and meals together. But again, he is mentioned in the book, but you can't, in a 50-minute talk, you can only say so much.
It's a long
I just
story.
suggest that comment about 1 per desk. I see my long-time good friend John Panther is, I think, muted but online somewhere. He designed the bloody thing. So he might have a comment to make. John?
Not only the 1 per desk, but also
unmute.
He was unmuted, yeah.
Yeah. No, in fact, not only the 1 per desk, which was a thing with Bombfield, but also, of course, the the Singer machines. I was responsible for that.
System 10, System
And
25.
the System 25. So yeah, I remember all of those.
Yeah, but Brian Caswell has bought his one per desk to wave at the camera. I'm afraid I can't bring an STL or an Essex to wave at the camera.
I can go one up. I've got a gold-plated one.
And that was based on the Sinclair QL as well, if I remember, with a lot of modifications. Indeed.
Yeah, lots of modifications. We finished up rewriting most of their software and the microdrive, redesigned it. Anyway, so it's a story in its own.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
But we did actually sell in excess of 100,000 of them. So it was the first time we got into real quantity. And of course, it was just before the IBM PC came out. And so it was destined to collapse, really, as a result of that introduction.
Yeah, it also changed our manufacturing phenomenally.
Absolutely.
We built more than 30 of. We did batch processing before that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It made us make lots of decisions, which, I mean, I think I would say we made us match fit for the changes away from mainframes. It probably wasn't match fit, but better than we were supposed to be. So Roger Cooper speaking, I'm getting excited because I love OPDs. It made us do things like getting rid of ICL transport. We could see that we no longer needed that sort of activity. But I mean, we had several board meetings about OPD. I was in the marketing team for it, and clearly one of the big outputs was again via Mike Forrest, who was our main man on it. Was, well, get rid of the bloody company if you don't need it. So we did. Very nice for the people who worked in it, but we couldn't carry it much longer.
Yeah.
On operating systems, Stuart, I don't know which Stuart it is, but Stuart has said, what about operating systems? Remember when George 3 had a 15 MTBF? Presumably that's 15 minutes between failing, or 15 hours, or 15 days?
Minutes.
Time between.
We certainly, when we were developing S3L, I think we were doing a lot of work on a 2970 or 2980 mainframe that we were all linked into, and that was one of the pre-production machines, and that used to fail regularly because the solder joints were a bit.
Yes, it was mean time between failure. I remember it getting up to 30 minutes, and people thought it done terribly well. And also, they mentioned the 2905, which was a beautiful combination of the 2900 series and 1900 code compatible.
Yes.
Which, got the company over a bit of a hump.
Yes, it did.
Well done, Stuart.
I've just been told off. It's not called the S3L. It's called the S3L, and it isn't the SX. It's the SX. I don't know about the S3L, because you probably know the apocryphal story that it was the LSI version of the S3 range that we'd done, and so we called the S3L.
Sorry.
And the Japanese couldn't say S3L, and so it became called the S3L. And they did ask me several times, what is this word S3L? And I was very embarrassed by not having to tell them the answer was because a certain person who isn't here today joked about how they pronounce the name.
Can somebody explain to me how Nortel got in on the act? Did they take over STC or something? I know they're paying my pension, but I can never understand why.
Part of STC.
Martin, does Nortel come into your timeline at all?
It doesn't. Well, I'm not sure it's mentioned in the book, but there was a connection with STC. I can't remember at this distance in time what that was, but somebody mentioned Mike Forrest earlier, and I interviewed him. He was a very mellow, nice. We had a really nice conversation, actually. But everybody said, who had worked with him, said, God, he was an absolute terror.
Yeah, true.
But Mike Forrest. but by the time I met him, he'd been retired a couple of years and obviously calmed down a great deal. We got on very well indeed.
No, but you shouldn't underestimate the contribution that Mike actually made to a lot of things, including new range and a lot of other parts of the business over time. Roger Cooper will back me up on that, right?
Yeah, he was a brilliant guy, but his man management skills were abysmal.
as we all agree.
I think we've all met a few of those, haven't we? There've been when we had links with Fujitsu before they took us over, Martin. They did try to get us to sell a machine called Atlas.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's in the book. Yeah.
Which was an IBM well, it was the IBM compatible. In fact, when we were doing the development for STL, etc., the design automation software that we were using ran on Fujitsu M190, I think it was, and an M380 machine. And I think can't remember if it was one of those that got rebadged as the Atlas.
Yeah.
Good old name.
Yeah, I think it did quite well. I think actually, and it sort of the message I got was it sort of rescued ICL's reputation a bit as being able to manufacture, the biggest kind of machines. I'm not sure what contribution it made to revenues. Not much, I don't think, but probably didn't make a loss either.
I've got a suggestion to Martin here for the future. You could do another session, if you put it together, of all the bits you've missed out on this history of ICL to allow everybody else to have an interesting chat about all the other things as well.
Well,
this is proving quite entertaining.
Bearing in mind that it's now 8 o'clock, and I did promise we'd finish at 8 o'clock, I'll give Martin a chance to plug his book first of all.
Yeah,
tell us about it and what it is, Martin, and whether it's still available, and can they buy copies from you?
Actually, you can. It is still available. It actually did quite well. When it was originally published, I think the original print run was about 1,000, but which actually is quite not at all bad for an academic book of its type. But when Fujitsu took over ICL, they ordered several thousand copies for the Japanese market. So I finally made a decent amount of money out of the book. Right now, you can get copies secondhand. They're quite pricey, I think, but it is actually available print on demand from Oxford University Press. A few years ago, when I was doing some reviewing for them, they offered to pay me some money or in books. So I said, well, can you just give me half a dozen copies of my print on demand book? And we settled that. I think I got them for about a tenner each. I think normally they're about 80 or something daft, but so it is more or less available, but quite pricey.
Sounds like you're not in this for the money, Martin.
That's
anyway, from my point of view, it's been wonderful, Martin. There's a lot of stuff in there I didn't know. I've only been into old computers really since I retired, and I'm learning an awful lot about the history of where I came to be where I was. A lot of fascinating stuff, loads more for me to learn about, and I'm hoping that the rest of you have learned quite a bit today. I am thrilled to see so many of my old colleagues here as well. It'd be lovely to talk to you some other time. Hope you can join another CCS talk in the future. Connect to the CCS online. It'll tell you when the talks are coming up. There's one coming up about ARPA, the predecessor to the internet. It's in a couple of weeks' time in the afternoon, if you can make it. Most of you being retired, I'm sure you can. And apart from that, it remains me to say to Martin, thank you very much. If we can all give him a silent bit of applause. Thank you very much, Martin. And thank you for taking up my invitation to come and talk to us again. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.